Sweat, soup, surfboard, sponge. Those are the four metaphors we're going to be using today to understand how moisture impacts your wildfire behavior. Now, before we get into that, I should just clarify something very important that I was even reminded of today as I was reading Chapter 3 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. It's that relative humidity isn't actually how much moisture is in the air. The exact formula for relative humidity is how much moisture is actually in the air divided by how much moisture that air could hold before reaching saturation. So with saturation, if your temperature goes up, your air can hold more moisture, and then if temperature goes down, your air can't hold as much moisture. So temperature is actually factored into the relative humidity equation, and that's a big part of the reason that just like we have diurnal changes in temperature, we often have diurnal changes in relative humidity. So as temperature goes up in the afternoon, the air can hold a lot more moisture. That bottom part of your equation is getting larger, and your relative humidity decreases. And then at nighttime, temperatures decrease, the air can't hold as much moisture, relative humidity increases. So thought that was just a good clarifying point right there. One other interesting thing about moisture in the air before we get into our metaphors is that moisture can actually affect your air temperatures as well. It's not just air temperature affecting your moisture. If you have more moisture in the air, that moisture can absorb some of the heat that's coming in. Water has a very high specific heat capacity. That's why the ocean doesn't warm up or cool down as fast as the land does. So if you have a lot of moisture in your air, like along a coastline, some of that daytime heating is going to get absorbed by the moisture that's in the air. So that's going to take out some of the energy that would be heating the air. So your daytime high temperatures are going to be lower. So it's going to moderate things. And then at nighttime, the reverse happens. Some of the heat is going to be emitted by the moisture, and it's going to make your nighttime temperatures just a little bit warmer. So more moisture in the air has a moderating effect. This relates back to wildfire because you can have a kind of positive feedback loop here where if you have a very dry environment, that can actually lead to warmer temperatures because there's not as much heat being absorbed by the water. And then warmer temperatures are going to increase the air's ability to hold moisture, and then that's going to decrease your relative humidity. Then that's going to decrease your fuel moisture, and then that is going to lead to worse wildfire activity. Now, a lot of what I just said will be explained by the metaphors we look at, but just continuing this kind of foundational knowledge on moisture in general, we'll also just go into our first metaphor, which is sweat. So if you've ever wondered why humans sweat, it's because that as liquid turns into water vapor, it steals or takes some of the energy from the environment around it, and then that's going to cool the environment down. So if your body is very hot, it creates a little liquid droplet, and then when that liquid droplet evaporates, it's going to take some energy from your body or take some heat from your body, and that's going to cool you down. So it's almost like this natural air conditioning system that we have built into our bodies, which is, I think, pretty cool. Now, the opposite can also happen in the atmosphere, where you have water vapor turning into liquid droplets. So that would be condensation instead of evaporation. And that's going to have the reverse effect. You're going to release some energy, you're going to release some heat, and that's going to warm up the air around that liquid droplet. Then warm air is less dense, so then that air is going to rise. And that's a big part of the reason, if you've ever seen a time lapse of a thunderstorm, how the column or the cloud just keeps getting taller and taller, that's a big part of what's driving that, the kind of physics and dynamics behind the scene. It's that you have water vapor turning into liquid droplets, that's heating up the air, and then that air is rising, and that's why your column or your clouds are rising as well. And in some cases, those can those clouds can get quite tall, maybe even reach the top of the troposphere. So that's the sweat metaphor right there. I think we've laid a good enough foundation on moisture to understand the further concepts. The next one was soup. Now, I kind of just used the word soup because it continued the nice little S for our metaphor, but actually just think of a bowl of water. And we're going to use this metaphor to understand what evaporation is on a kind of more intellectual level, even though we're talking about soup or a bowl of water. Condensation, and then saturation, because saturation is a word that's thrown around a lot, but maybe people don't totally intuitively understand it. And to be honest, this metaphor that I learned today certainly helped my understanding. So you have a bowl of water, we're going to call it soup, and at all times you have some of that liquid that is going from liquid into water vapor, and it's, you'd say, evaporating. But at the same time, you're also going to have some of the water vapor that's in the air condensing, turning into liquid droplets, and going back into that bowl of water. Now, what you would call overall evaporation is if you have more droplets going from liquid into the air. That's going to be overall evaporation. Now, if you have more water vapor turning into liquid, that's going to be more going into the dish. That's going to be condensation. And then here's kind of the punchline. When the amount going out and the amount going in are balanced and reaching an equilibrium, they're the exact same, that's what you would call saturation. So that is very important when it comes to our fuels. And because, how do I want to get right into this? Basically, if the air is warmer, it can hold more water vapor, and then that's going to make your relative humidity go down. If your relative humidity goes down, that's going to make the air drier, and that's going to make your fuels drier. To understand that, you could think of, instead of water to your bowl of soup or your bowl of water, think of air to your plants. So if your temperatures go up, your relative humidity goes down, your air gets drier, and you still have a lot of moisture in your fuel, now you have the atmosphere, or your environment wants to reach that equilibrium, that balance. So it's almost like it's going to be pulling some of the moisture out of your fuels to try to reach that balance. So drier air makes your fuel drier because of that little boundary between the two. And then the reverse can also happen. So that would be like the evaporation technique right there, where it's evaporating moisture out of your fuels. Now the opposite would be, let's say we got some onshore winds, it blows in a bunch of moisture from the ocean onto our coastal plants. The relative humidity jumps up to 90%. There's a lot of moisture in the air. What that's going to do is now all of a sudden there's more moisture in the air than in your plant. So now you can almost think of the plant as kind of pulling some of that moisture out of the air to try to reach that equilibrium. So moisture in the air goes into your fuels, increases your fuel moisture, and there's some points of fuel moisture that are so high, or some relative humidities that are so high, that you're just not going to have any fire danger whatsoever. Now, it also depends on the size of the fuel, how easily that happens, but I'm going to save that for when we're talking about our sponge metaphor. We'll go into the surfboard one first, just in case you're still a little unsure about what I just said. So, it depends, and it matters how dry your fuel is before. It depends on how fast your fires are going to be able to ignite and how fast your fire is going to be able to spread. The basic takeaway here is that if you have a very large fuel moisture, there's a certain threshold it has to cross before that plant is going to combust and turn into your fire. So if you're starting at 40% fuel moisture, and let's say it's going to take a lot of drying and take a lot of energy from the environment, a lot of maybe warm air, dry air, to pull that moisture out, and then it goes down to the point where your plant is going to combust. Versus, let's say your plant is at 15% fuel moisture. There's a lot less moisture that has to be evaporated out of that plant before it is going to combust. So it takes less energy from the environment, or in some cases even from the fire itself, to get that plant ready to the point where it becomes the fire as well. So the surfboard metaphor here is, let's say you want to buy a surfboard and it's $100. So it's pretty cheap, it's a used board, and you make $20 an hour. If you already have $80 in your bank account, then you only have to work 1 hour in order to buy that surfboard. But if you have $60 in your bank account, you have to work 2 hours to buy that surfboard. So the further away you are from that threshold, the more work you have to put in to buy the surfboard. $100 being the threshold you have to cross in order to have enough money to purchase the board. It's the same thing with fuel moistures. The closer you are to that threshold where your fuel is going to turn into fire, the less work, the less energy the environment has to use to get you to that threshold. So if less energy is being used on one plant, then that means there's more energy left over for the next one. So that's why if you have dry fuels, more of the fire's energy can just be turned into combusting fuels as opposed to evaporating moisture. Hopefully that one made sense. Next, let's talk about sponges. All right, this is going to be the last one here. So with sponges, first thing you should know is that the amount of rainfall you're getting doesn't tell the whole story on how much your wildfire danger is going to be decreased, because there's another important variable mixed in there, which is over what period of time you're picking up that rainfall. So if you get 1 inch over 48 hours, your soils are maybe going to be able to absorb all of that water. So your soil moisture increases, some of that moisture finds its way into your fuels, it's trying to reach equilibrium in that sense as well, and that's going to reduce your fire danger probably significantly depending on how much rain you get. Now, if you pick up 1 inch in 1 hour, your soils aren't going to be able to absorb all of that, and some of that's just going to turn into runoff. So in this, you could just think of a sponge. Let's say you put a sponge in the bottom of your sink and you barely lift I don't know if you call it faucet, you barely lift it up so it's just releasing 1 drop. And then you let that drop on your sponge for 48 hours. Every drop is going to be absorbed into the sponge until your sponge is completely saturated, where you'd have as much water leaving the sponge as much coming in, because the sponge just can't hold any more water, just like your soils can become saturated at a certain point. Now compare that to if you put that sponge in the bottom of your sink, you just put the faucet all the way as hard as it can. It pours out all of the water that was released over 48 hours. It pours it all out in, like a minute. That's a lot of that water is just going to be bouncing off the sponge, running off down the sink. And at the end of that minute, you might actually still have some air bubbles trapped inside of that sponge, and it's not going to be completely saturated. It would have the ability to absorb more water if you maybe put it on a little bit more slowly. And overall, the sponge or your soil is going to be drier. So it's not going to have as large of an impact on your fuel moistures and then as much of a decrease in your fire danger. Now, the other thing that you need to know that kind of ties almost everything we've talked about together is you can also think of 2 different size sponges. So let's say you have one very, maybe just a small sponge, and then you have one very large sponge. If you pour some water on the small sponge and you pour some water on the large sponge, for the small sponge, maybe that's going to be absorbed all the way through it, especially if it's pretty thin, and that's going to increase the overall moisture of that sponge to a large degree because it's going to be absorbed through the surface. Now on the large sponge, a lot of that moisture is not even going to reach the middle of the sponge. So it's going to overall be a lot drier. Now the same thing happens with your different sized fuels. Your grasses are going to respond to the environment and the moisture in the air very quickly, and your large fuels are going to respond very slowly. The kind of sciencey explanation behind this is your small fuels, like a grass, a lot more of that fuel is surface area. So surface area to volume ratio is the exact way to put it. And it's the surface that is interacting with the atmosphere around it. So that's where you're going to have that boundary between the moisture in the air and the moisture in your fuel. On your very large fuels, overall you might have more of a surface, but the surface area to volume ratio is going to be much smaller than the grass. So the overall boundary compared to how much of that fuel you have, how large that sponge is, it's going to respond a lot more slowly to changes in atmospheric moisture. So if that doesn't make sense, you just need to know that we have different fuels different categories of fuels that we call 1-hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, 1,000-hour fuels. 1-hour fuels might be your grasses. So if your relative humidity goes up, all of a sudden moisture starts crossing that boundary into your fuel within an hour, and you can feel a change in the moisture in your grass within an hour. Now with 100-hour fuels, that might be something about the size of your wrist, and that's going to, not a big surprise, take 100 hours in order for it to start responding to the environment. So what that means is that your smaller fuels may be able to change within even an afternoon, whereas the very large fuels like a tree may even change on more of a seasonal scale. And then kind of stemming off of that, no pun intended, it also depends on like how much rainfall you're picking up. That's going to have different impacts on different size fuels. So this morning I was forecasting some rainfall moving in. I said, we're picking up some rainfall. It's not a lot, but at this point in the year, we're still in fire season. We'll take whatever we can get. But I should have clarified that there is a certain amount of rain that you need in order to actually reduce your fire danger. For grasses and shrubs, you need about 0.1 inches before you can say, okay, this is actually going to slow fire danger or slow fire spread because we picked up this rain. So 0.1 for grasses and shrubs, whereas for dense canopy, you need about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch to really feel the change in how easily a fire could start or how fast it is going to spread. So thought that was pretty interesting. The final thing that I'm just going to say is that there's also this question, because throughout this video I've been kind of using an assumption here that drier air means drier fuels means worse wildfire. But there, as always, there's a bit of nuance and complexity that's left out when you just make that generalization. And that is when it comes down to those grasses, where in a very dry year, you're not going to have as many grasses growing. So there would be, and grasses can spread fire very easily. So you'd actually have less ability to spread fire in a dry year according to just grasses. In a very wet year, you're going to have more grasses popping up, and then that could actually increase your fire spread because, as we just learned, grasses respond to the atmosphere very quickly. So those grasses, even though you did have maybe a very wet winter in California, second you get into summer, those grasses dry out very quickly, and then all of a sudden you have all this fuel built up where you can have more fire spread. Now overall, I would still say that dry years are worse for wildfire danger because maybe it's not as bad in terms of ability for fire spread because grasses can maybe lead to more acres burned. But if you're looking at how extreme a wildfire is going to be. That's going to be more when you go from fire burning in your grass into your brush into your trees, turn into like a big crown fire. Those are the most intense wildfires. And that is going to be a lot more likely in a dry year because those larger fuels like brush and especially trees respond to the atmosphere much more slowly. So you kind of need a whole dry year or California to be in drought in order for the fire to really make it into the canopy or turn into a crown fire and lead to that very extreme wildfire behavior where basically everything is burning. So I know we covered a lot throughout the course of this video. I maybe even confused myself a couple times just because there's so many different points I was trying to make, but hopefully the little metaphors I put forward, hopefully at least one of them clicked for you and you learned something about how moisture impacts wildfire danger in California. And I'm going to continue to read through fire in California's ecosystems. I'm also going to continue to get better at communicating what I'm learning. So if you want to come along on this journey, you can stick around, and thanks for watching.